Fame looks powerful. It buys private jets, bends time, and makes the impossible happen. But at 10,000 feet, the laws of physics do not care who is on board. We all remember the headlines: an NBA legend, a rock band in their prime. They took off believing they would be home for dinner or on stage by evening. Instead, their flights became history. In this documentary, we examine history's most notable aviation tragedies, the crashes that shocked the world because of who was on board. We move past the headlines and famous names to understand what really happened. If you appreciate thorough aviation documentaries, please subscribe, like, and share. It helps us to continue. On a gray Sunday morning in Southern California, a familiar helicopter lifted off from John Wayne Airport. Inside were 9 people: Kobe Bryant, his daughter Gianna, 2 of her teammates and their parents, a basketball coach, and the pilot Ara Zobayan. They were heading to a youth tournament at Kobe's training facility in Thousand Oaks. For years, Kobe had used helicopters to cut through Los Angeles traffic. The Sikorsky S-76B that carried him that morning was a twin-engine helicopter operated by Island Express Helicopters, a small charter company specializing in flights around Los Angeles. The weather didn't look dramatic on the ground. No storm, no heavy rain, no strong winds. The danger was in the sky, a low cloud layer hanging over the hills, with fog filling the canyons and valleys. The Los Angeles Police Department had already grounded its own helicopters that morning because the clouds were too low. At a little after 9, the Sikorsky lifted off and turned north. This was a charter flight under visual flight rules, meaning the pilot had to stay clear of clouds and keep the ground in sight. Island Express didn't have approval for instrument flight rules, so even though the helicopter had the equipment, the company's certificate kept all passenger flights visual only. The helicopter flew up the coast and then inland, following the major freeways. Near Burbank, the pilot requested clearance to pass through controlled airspace at low altitude. Controllers had him circle, then cleared him west toward Calabasas. For the passengers, this was a short hop to a game, but the clouds were hugging the hills. As the helicopter moved west, the ground rose and the clouds didn't lift. The valley narrowed. Witnesses later reported seeing the Sikorsky flying low, disappearing into and out of patches of mist. At this point, the pilot had choices: turn around, divert to an airport, or land and wait. Instead, he kept going. The NTSB later concluded he was likely feeling pressure to complete the trip for a well-known client on a tight schedule. Near Calabasas, the pilot began to climb, trying to rise above the clouds. Radar shows the helicopter starting a climbing left turn. Inside the cockpit, the view would have quickly turned to gray. No visible horizon. Mountains and valleys hidden. What happened next took less than a minute. Instead of climbing, the helicopter rolled left and began to descend. The pilot reported climbing, but the data shows the opposite, losing height in a tightening left turn. This is classic spatial disorientation. The inner ear sends false signals, and corrections based on feeling make things worse. Without flight recorders, investigators reconstructed the final moments from radar, wreckage, and weather reports. The helicopter descended in a steep turn toward rising ground at high speed. Witnesses heard the rotor, then a sharp increase in noise, then impact. The Sikorsky struck a hillside, broke apart, and caught fire. There were no survivors. Investigators examined every piece of evidence. The engines showed no mechanical failure. They reviewed the pilot's training, the company's safety practices, and the weather conditions. In its final report, the NTSB concluded the primary cause was the pilot's decision to continue flying under visual rules into cloud and fog, leading to spatial disorientation and loss of control. Contributing factors were self-induced pressure to complete the trip and the company's lack of strong safety barriers against flying in marginal weather. Fans gathered at the crash site and at the arena where Kobe had played for 20 years. Lawsuits were filed, and there were renewed calls for better warning systems on passenger helicopters. That short flight through the fog became the moment when a global figure, young athletes, and their parents disappeared from the sky on an ordinary winter morning. On August 25, 2001, Aaliyah and a small group from her team arrived at Marsh Harbor Airport in the Abaco Islands, in the Bahamas. They had just finished shooting the music video for Rock the Boat and were trying to get back to Florida earlier than planned. The original plan had been to leave the next day, but the work wrapped ahead of schedule and they arranged a flight that same evening, bound for Opa-locka Airport near Miami. The airplane waiting for them on the ramp was a twin-engine Cessna 402B, operated by a small charter company called Black Hawk International Airways. It was smaller than the aircraft that had brought part of the crew to the Bahamas, but on paper it still had enough seats to carry everyone and their baggage. In reality, the group had a lot of gear: heavy video equipment cases, personal bags, and 9 people in total, including Aaliyah. Witnesses at the airport later told investigators that there was an argument on the ramp about the weight of the airplane. The pilot, Luis Morales, was heard saying there was too much cargo and too many people for a safe flight. Members of the group insisted that they had to leave that evening and that they they had chartered the airplane for the whole party. According to those witnesses, the pilot eventually gave in and loaded the bags himself. Two of the heaviest passengers were seen seated in the rear, which pushed the center of gravity even further aft. Around 6:45 in the evening, the Cessna began its takeoff on runway 27, a 5,000-foot strip with water and marsh beyond the far end. The airplane used roughly half the runway before lifting off. Witnesses reported that it climbed in a very steep nose-up attitude, reaching only about 40 feet above the ground. Then the nose dropped, the airplane rolled left, and in a matter of seconds it struck marshy terrain just beyond the runway, breaking apart and catching fire. The wreckage came to rest only about 200 feet past the end of the pavement. All 9 people on board, including Aaliyah, were fatally injured. The crash itself was not complex. There was no long sequence of turns, no en route emergency, no radio call for help. It was a classic loss of control right after liftoff. What made it complex was what investigators found when they looked at how the flight had been set up. The Bahamian Civil Aviation Department determined that the aircraft was more than 900 pounds over its maximum allowable takeoff weight and was carrying 1 more passenger than it was certified to carry. Calculations based on the recovered baggage and estimated body weights showed the center of gravity about 4.4 inches behind the aft limit. In that condition, the airplane would want to pitch its nose up aggressively, and the pilot's ability to push the nose down and recover from a stall would be badly reduced. A post-crash examination found no evidence of pre-impact engine or structural failure. There were administrative findings against the operator, however. Black Hawk International Airways was authorized as a single-pilot operation with a different pilot listed as its only approved captain. The accident pilot, Morales, had been hired only days before the crash, and regulators later noted that Black Hawk was not authorized to assign him as pilot in command. His logbooks contained large, unexplained jumps in total hours and listed flights in aircraft types that did not match the official records, indicating that he had falsified parts of his experience to qualify for charter work. Toxicology added another layer. The coroner's inquest and forensic reports showed traces of cocaine metabolites in the pilot's urine and traces of ethanol in his body. That did not prove that he was acutely intoxicated at the moment of takeoff, but it confirmed recent drug use and raised serious questions about judgment in a situation that already involved pressure from passengers, an overloaded airplane, and a late-day departure. Investigators also looked at the company's maintenance and oversight. Regulatory records showed previous administrative actions against Black Hawk for maintenance-related issues and for not having properly qualified personnel in charge of upkeep. In this accident, the engines and controls appeared capable of normal operation before impact, but the broader picture was of a small charter operator with weak systems for weight and balance, pilot vetting, and compliance with its operating limits. In the end, the official findings were clear. The primary factors were an aircraft loaded well beyond its certified weight, a center of gravity pushed too far aft, and a pilot who was not properly qualified under charter rules and who had misrepresented his experience. The airplane tried to fly, pitched up too steeply, stalled with very little height available, and had no room to recover. Fame, money, and the urgency of a music video schedule could not change the basic physics of weight, balance, and lift. On February 6, 1958, a charter flight sat on the apron at Munich Riem Airport in West Germany, engines idling in falling snow. On board were the Busby Babes of Manchester United, one of the youngest, most exciting teams in Europe, alongside staff, journalists, and other passengers. They were flying home from Belgrade after knocking Red Star out of the European Cup. The route was too long to fly non-stop, so the team's British European Airways charter had stopped in Munich to refuel. The players had already had a long day. They had drawn 3-3 in Yugoslavia, celebrated in the dressing room, then boarded an overnight flight that stopped in Paris before reaching Munich. Now they were stuck on the ground again in winter weather, waiting for a fuel truck and for the snow to ease. The plan was to refuel, take off, and be back in Manchester that afternoon, still riding the momentum of a European run that felt like the start of a dynasty. After refueling, the crew lined up for departure. The captain and co-pilot began the takeoff roll, but as the aircraft accelerated, the left engine began to surge, its thrust rising and falling unexpectedly. The captain rejected the takeoff, pulled the power to idle, and brought the aircraft to a stop. The passengers felt the braking and the deceleration, but for a football team used to rough pitches and sudden changes, it was just an inconvenience. The crew taxied back, checked the engine settings, and tried again. On the second attempt, the same surge appeared. Again, the takeoff was abandoned. At this point, with snow still falling and the afternoon moving on, there was a choice. They could stay overnight in Munich and try again in better weather the next day, or they could attempt a third takeoff. The captain asked for the cabin to stay strapped in, and prepared for another try. The idea of being stranded overnight was unpopular. Many of the players wanted to get home. By the time the aircraft lined up once more, snow had been falling steadily. At the far end of the runway, slush was building up. Wet, heavy snow that looks harmless from a distance, but grabs at wheels and robs speed. The third attempt began like the others. The engines spooled up, the brakes were released, and the aircraft began to accelerate. In the cabin, some passengers later remembered a feeling that the takeoff seemed to be taking longer than usual, the runway lights sliding by without the nose lifting. Near the end of the runway, the aircraft hit the deeper band of slush. Investigators later calculated that the drag from that slush cut the acceleration just when the airplane most needed to build the last few knots of speed. Instead of climbing onto the snow and flying, the wheels dug in. The airspeed stopped increasing. There was no longer enough runway left to safely stop, and not enough speed to lift off and clear the obstacles ahead. Seconds later, the aircraft overran the end of the runway, broke through a fence, and crossed a road. It struck a house and a hut, tore apart, and came to rest near a fuel installation. Part of the wreckage caught fire. People in nearby buildings heard the impact and saw the flames in the snow. Rescue workers and airport staff rushed out into the storm, picking their way through debris, seats, and luggage scattered across the slush-covered ground. There had been 44 people on board. 20 died at the scene, including 7 members of the team and several journalists. 3 more, including star wing half Duncan Edwards and the co-pilot, died later in hospital. In total, 23 people were lost. 8 Manchester United players, 3 club staff, journalists, and other passengers and crew. Manager Matt Busby was critically injured and not expected to live. He was given the last rites twice but survived after weeks in a Munich hospital. Some players, like Bobby Charlton and goalkeeper Harry Gregg, walked away with injuries and trauma, but would return to the game. Others, such as Johnny Berry and Jackie Blanchflower, were hurt so badly they never played again. In the early months, there was controversy over what or who to blame. Initial German reports pointed at the captain and suggested he had failed to clear ice from the wings. A later, fuller investigation, drawing on performance data and tests, shifted the focus to the runway itself. The official conclusion was that slush contamination at the far end of the runway robbed the aircraft of the acceleration it needed to take off, and that the effects of that slush had not been fully understood or properly accounted for in the takeoff decision. The captain was eventually cleared of negligence. For football, the disaster reshaped a club and a country. The Busby Babes had an average age in their early 20s and were expected to dominate English and European football for years. Instead, fans woke up to newspapers carrying photographs of broken metal in the snow and lists of names that would never appear on a team sheet again. Manchester United rebuilt slowly under the same manager who had nearly died in Munich, eventually winning the European Cup a decade later with a different generation. Around Old Trafford and at the crash site near the old Munich airport, memorials still mark February 6th as the day that a team full of promise was cut down on a frozen runway by a few inches of slush and a decision to try one more takeoff. On October 20th, 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd were in the middle of what should have been a victory lap. 2 days earlier, they had released Street Survivors. That night, they played a sold-out show in Greenville, South Carolina. The next stop was Baton Rouge, where they were booked to play at Louisiana State University. Instead of taking the bus, the band and crew boarded a twin-engine propeller airliner chartered for the tour. The airplane was an older piston-powered propliner that had started its life in airline service decades earlier. People around the tour had mixed feelings about it. There were stories of minor problems on earlier legs, including passengers seeing flames from one engine. The band were already talking about upgrading to a jet as soon as they reached Baton Rouge. This was supposed to be the last trip on the old airplane. Late that afternoon, the musicians and crew took their seats. Lead singer Ronnie Van Zant stretched out on the cabin floor with a pillow. Others played cards in the back. The airplane took off from Greenville and headed southwest toward Baton Rouge, with a planned flight time of a little over 2 hours. For much of the trip, nothing seemed unusual. Somewhere over the pine forests of the Deep South, the mood shifted. The engines didn't sound right. Drummer Artemis Pyle went forward and looked into the cockpit. The captain told him to go back and strap in. Something was wrong. Up front, the crew had realized they didn't have enough fuel to reach Baton Rouge. The airplane's fuel gauges had a history of being unreliable, and the pilots hadn't physically checked the fuel before departure. They called air traffic control and reported they were low on fuel. Controllers gave them vectors toward a small airport near Macomb, Mississippi, but the fuel situation was already too far gone. First one engine lost power, then the other. With both engines out, the airplane became a heavy glider. The pilots aimed for an open field in the fading light, trying to get over the trees. In the cabin, the card game stopped. Some passengers prayed, others tightened their seatbelts. They never reached the clearing. Just before sunset, over rural Mississippi near Gillsburg, the airplane began clipping the tops of the trees. Guitarist Gary Rossington later said it sounded like hundreds of baseball bats slamming against the metal. The fuselage plowed through the forest until it struck one big tree head-on and broke apart. The cabin tore open, and people were thrown into the swampy woods. Lead singer Ronnie Van Zant, guitarist Steve Gaines, backing vocalist Cassie Gaines, assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick, and both pilots were killed. 20 others survived, but almost all were badly hurt. Artemis Pyle and 2 other survivors stumbled through the woods toward a nearby farmhouse. The homeowner, seeing 3 bloody strangers just after dark, initially fired a warning shot, thinking they were escaped prisoners. Once he understood there had been a plane crash, he called for help. Rescue crews had difficulty reaching the site. The wreckage sat in thick woods and soft ground. Local residents and emergency workers formed improvised teams, carrying survivors out on doors and makeshift stretchers. The National Transportation Safety Board examined the wreckage and engines and took fuel samples. They found no evidence of mechanical failure. What they did find was an almost complete lack of usable fuel on board. The final report concluded that the airplane had run out of fuel. The official wording was fuel exhaustion and total loss of power on both engines due to crew inattention to fuel supply. The pilots hadn't made sure there was enough fuel for the trip and hadn't monitored the situation en route. A contributing factor was an engine problem that may have increased fuel consumption, but proper planning could have prevented the tanks from running dry. The crash froze Lynyrd Skynyrd at a strange moment. The band had just released an album with a cover showing them standing in front of flames. After the accident, that artwork was changed out of respect for the dead. The group, as people knew it in 1977, ceased to exist overnight. Only a decade later would a new version of the band return to the stage, led by Ronnie's younger brother Johnny Van Zant. On the afternoon of October 2nd, 1970, 2 charter planes sat on the ramp in Wichita, Kansas, waiting for the Wichita State Shockers football team. They were headed to Logan, Utah, for a game against Utah State. Because the university couldn't get one large airplane, the team had been split in 2. One plane nicknamed Gold, carrying most of the starters, coaches, administrators, and boosters, and a second, Black, carrying the reserves and more staff. From Wichita, they flew west to Denver for fuel. After landing at Stapleton Airport, both airplanes were supposed to continue along a safe, established route that would let them climb high before crossing the Rocky Mountains. The Black plane stuck to that plan and arrived in Utah without incident. The Gold plane did not. On Gold, the cockpit dynamic was unusual. The president of the charter company was at the controls in the left seat, but he didn't actually hold the proper qualification on this type of airplane. The younger pilot in the right seat technically had the official rating and was listed as captain, even though the older company president was calling most of the shots. Before leaving Denver, the pilots talked enthusiastically about taking a scenic route so the team could see the Rockies up close. Instead of climbing along a safer airway, they planned to follow a highway west through Clear Creek Valley, past ski resorts, then over a mountain pass and on toward Utah. On a clear day in a light aircraft, that valley can look inviting. In a heavy, older airliner loaded with people and fuel, it was a different story. Early that afternoon, the Gold plane took off in clear weather and turned toward the mountains. Passengers settled in for what they thought would be a 1-hour hop. Out the windows, the flat plains gave way to rising ground, then steep walls of rock and trees. At first, the view was spectacular. The airplane flew along the valley, following the road and river below. But as they went deeper, something began to feel wrong. Passengers could see mines and tree lines on the slopes above their window level. The mountains around them were now higher than the airplane. Ahead, the valley curved and tightened. The pilots kept the airplane low, apparently more focused on giving a close-up tour than on climbing to a safer height. What they didn't fully appreciate was the terrain beyond the bend, a high pass and ridges rising to around 12,000 feet and more. Calculations done later showed that the airplane could have climbed well above the mountaintops if it had started climbing right away. Instead, it cruised up the valley at roughly 11,000 feet, trading precious altitude for sightseeing. The valley they were following was, in effect, a trap. By the time the pilots finally saw the true wall of rock rising in front of them, they were already in what mountain pilots call a box canyon, a dead-end valley with steep sides and no easy escape. On the ground, people driving the highway pulled over and watched in disbelief. The airplane was clearly too low for the terrain ahead. In the cockpit, the realization hit all at once. The pilots rolled into a hard turn, trying to reverse course inside a narrowing bowl of rock and trees. Survivors remembered the airplane banking steeply, the engines working hard, the valley wall looming in every window. At that low speed and altitude, with the airplane heavy and close to its limits, there was almost no margin left. Seconds later, the wings began slicing through treetops on the side of Mount Trelise. Tree trunks tore into the engines and wings. The fuselage plowed through the forest and broke into several sections, coming to rest on a steep slope high above the road. The time was about 1:14 in the afternoon. Local weather was calm and clear. There had been no storm, no fog, no mechanical explosion. The mountain had simply risen faster than the airplane. Many people survived the initial impact. Inside the cabin, however, most passengers hadn't been wearing seatbelts. Rows of seats ripped loose from the floor and piled up toward the front, trapping people under a crush of metal and bodies. Some players and staff managed to claw their way out and tumble onto the slope. Others were pinned in place, calling for help. Aviation fuel began to leak and then ignited. Survivors later recalled hearing voices fade as fire and smoke swept through the wreck. Construction workers from a nearby tunnel project and motorists on the highway were among the first to reach the site. Teenagers from a mountain rescue training group helped carry survivors down the hill. Of the 40 people on board, 31 ultimately died, including 14 players, the head coach, the athletic director, community leaders, and crew members. Only 9 people survived. When the National Transportation Safety Board reconstructed what had happened, they found no hidden mechanical failure. The engines had been running. The weather was good. The route choice and the way it was flown were the problem. Investigators concluded that the crew had failed to plan properly for the terrain, had chosen a low-level scenic route through rising mountains without understanding the climb needed to clear the pass, and had continued into a valley where there was no longer room to turn or climb out. The accident also exposed bigger issues. The airplane belonged to one company, the crew came from another, and the charter was arranged by the university. Each pointed at someone else when asked who was really in charge of safety. In the years that followed, the rules for on-demand charter flights and oversight of small operators grew tighter. Back in Wichita, the human cost was immediate and overwhelming. The black plane landed in Utah to learn there would be no game. Wichita State held a memorial on the field instead. On campus, classes were canceled. The remaining players eventually chose to finish the season with a rebuilt roster in what became known as the second season. Today, a memorial stands on campus, and a plaque beside the interstate in Colorado marks the trail up to the wreck. Much of the twisted metal is still on the slope above the highway, slowly disappearing into the trees. On the night of November 14th, 1970, a charter jet descended through cloud and rain toward a small airport in West Virginia. On board were almost the entire Marshall University football team, their coaches, staff, and local boosters returning from a game at East Carolina. In Huntington, families and friends were waiting outside the terminal, watching for the lights of the airplane that was supposed to bring their team home. The flight was Southern Airways Flight 932, a twin-engine jet airliner chartered for this one trip. Marshall didn't usually fly. Most away games were reached by bus. Just 6 weeks earlier, another college team from Wichita State had lost players in a crash in Colorado, and there had been debate about whether to take an airplane at all. The university ultimately approved the charter, believing a modern jet would be safer than a long overnight drive through the mountains. The day had gone as planned. Marshall lost the game in Greenville, North Carolina, 17-14, but spirits were still high. After the game, players, coaches, and supporters boarded the jet at Kinston for the return leg to Tri-State Airport near Huntington. The flight climbed to cruise altitude and headed northwest as a routine night flight. Weather at Tri-State that night was poor: rain, fog, and a low cloud base. Visibility was reduced and the runway was wet. It wasn't a storm, but it was the kind of murky Appalachian night that makes flying by sight nearly impossible. The only safe way down was to fly a published instrument approach, following radio beams and altitude targets to a minimum height, where the runway either had to be in sight or the crew had to climb away. Just after 7:30 in the evening, the crew reported passing the outer marker for the approach to runway. They were cleared to land. The procedure was a non-precision approach, lateral guidance to line up with the runway, but no electronic glide path. The pilots had to step down in stages, leveling off at a published minimum descent altitude and holding there until they could see the runway. Descending below that minimum without the runway in sight isn't allowed because hills and obstacles may be ahead. On the flight deck were an experienced captain and a younger first officer. With them was a charter coordinator from the airline standing behind the seats. The cockpit recorders captured their final minutes. As they came down through the clouds, the co-pilot called out altitudes and commented that he was starting to see some light from the ground, around 700 feet. They were still about 200 feet above the minimum altitude. The charter coordinator quietly predicted it would probably be a missed approach. Instead of leveling off, the descent continued. The recorders showed the jet sinking another couple hundred feet in just seconds. Outside, the pilots could see lights from an oil refinery in the valley floor ahead. The airport sat on higher ground, several hundred feet above that refinery. Investigators later suggested this difference in elevation, combined with the bright industrial lights, might have created a visual illusion that made the pilots feel higher than they really were. Down in the cabin, players and staff had buckled in for landing. Instead, a few seconds before they should have reached the runway, the jet's wings began slicing into treetops on a wooded hillside more than a mile short of the airport. Then the nose hit the slope, and the airplane broke apart and exploded. Everyone on board, 75 people in total, died in the impact and fire. The crash site was difficult to reach in the dark and rain. Fire crews found a swath of ground, blackened and still burning, with fragments scattered among the trees. The jet had struck the hill and disintegrated. In Huntington, the impact hit far beyond the campus. On board were 37 players, most of the coaching staff, trainers, the athletic director, and prominent local citizens. 70 children lost at least one parent that night. The next day, the university held a memorial service. The crash became the worst sports-related air disaster in U.S. history. The National Transportation Safety Board examined the wreckage and recorded data. They found no sign of structural or engine failure. The evidence showed a controlled airplane descending below the approach's minimum altitude in darkness and poor weather until it hit terrain that should have been safely below it. The board concluded the probable cause was descent below minimum descent altitude during a non-precision approach, without the runway in sight. They pointed to two likely explanations: misuse of instruments, or an error in the altimetry system that made the crew believe they were higher than they really were. Out of this tragedy came quiet changes. The accident helped drive recommendations for better ground proximity warning devices, improved displays for altitude awareness, and stricter training for how airlines conduct approaches at night into hilly airports. For Marshall and Huntington, every year on the anniversary, the university gathers at the memorial fountain on campus. The water is turned off in silence, in memory of a team that never came home and a flight that was almost where it needed to be, but not quite high enough to clear the last hill in the dark. On the night of November 28, 2016, a charter flight left Santa Cruz de la Sierra in Bolivia carrying a team that felt like a fairy tale. Associação Chapecoense de Futebol, from the small Brazilian city of Chapecoense, was on its way to play the biggest match in its history, the Copa Sudamericana final in Medellin, Colombia. Players, coaches, club directors, journalists, and guests filled the cabin. For many of them, this trip was the reward for years of climbing from the lower divisions to a continental final that nobody had expected them to reach. The airplane was a four-engine regional jet operated by a tiny company called Lamia. This airline had made a business out of flying football teams around South America. They had carried Chapecoense before. Just weeks earlier, they had flown the Argentina national team with Lionel Messi on board. To the people in the cabin, this felt reassuring. Behind the scenes, the planning already had problems. International rules meant the Bolivian charter airline couldn't pick up passengers in São Paulo and fly them directly to Colombia. So the club flew on a regular airline from São Paulo to Santa Cruz, then boarded the Lamia jet for the last leg. The distance from Santa Cruz to Medellin was close to the limit of what the aircraft could fly on a full load of fuel. The first version of the flight plan included a fuel stop, but the chosen airport would be closed by the time they got there. Instead of picking another stop, the dispatcher and captain went ahead with a direct flight that left almost no safety margin. The jet took off that evening with 77 people on board, 73 passengers and 4 crew. Some players tried to rest, others joked with journalists, filmed each other on their phones, and talked about the final. Outside the windows, the lights of Santa Cruz faded, and the airplane climbed into the dark across the Andes, heading north toward Colombia. For most of the cruise, nothing dramatic happened. The crew didn't report any technical failure, and there was no bad weather. The problem was invisible. The fuel. The planned flight time and the amount of fuel on board left no buffer for holding or delays. When low fuel warning lights came on in the cockpit, they did so more than half an hour before the crash. The crew discussed the situation but kept pressing on toward Medellin instead of diverting and landing as soon as possible. As the jet approached Colombian airspace, air traffic around Medellin was busy. Another airplane ahead had reported a possible fuel leak and was requesting priority. Controllers instructed the Lamia flight to enter a holding pattern and wait its turn. The crew asked for priority because of fuel problems, but they didn't use the formal words that declare an emergency. Without that clear call, controllers treated them as urgent, but not as a mayday. The jet began circling, flying 2 full laps that added valuable minutes to a flight already at the edge of its endurance. Inside the cabin, most passengers had no idea how tight the margins had become. On the flight deck, the crew finally declared a fuel emergency, but by then they'd been running on almost empty for a long time. Within minutes, one pair of engines flamed out, then the other pair. With the engines stopped, electrical power began to fail. The pilot's final message to air traffic control was simple and desperate: total electrical failure and no fuel. At that point, the jet was still only a short distance from its destination, less than 20 kilometers from the runway, but it was too low and too heavy to glide over the mountains in between. In the dark, with rain in the area and no engine power, the crew tried to keep the airplane flying as long as they could. The ground rose beneath them. A few seconds later, the aircraft struck the crest of a ridge on a mountain known as Cerro Gordo, broke apart, and scattered across both sides of the slope. Because there was almost no fuel left, there was no major fire. Rescue teams had to climb up steep terrain in rain and mud to reach the wreckage. They found a broken fuselage, wings torn away, and debris spread across the hillside. Out of the 77 people on board, 71 had died in the impact. There were 6 survivors, 3 players, 2 crew members, and 1 journalist, all badly injured, but alive among the wreckage of a team that had been just days away from playing a continental final. When investigators reconstructed the accident, they found no evidence of mechanical failure. Fuel samples confirmed what the absence of fire already suggested. There was essentially no usable fuel left. Records showed that Lamia had a pattern of planning flights right at the edge of the aircraft's range. On this flight, the plan didn't include a realistic alternate airport or proper contingency fuel. The final report was blunt. The direct cause of the crash was fuel exhaustion, brought on by an inappropriate flight plan, and the crew's decision to continue without refueling, despite knowing their fuel level was critically low. The report also pointed to deeper issues: weak safety culture at Lamia, poor oversight by authorities, and the crew's delay in declaring an emergency. Every layer that was supposed to add protection, planning, company checks, regulatory supervision, and cockpit decision-making, failed in the same direction, toward risk. In Brazil, the reaction went far beyond the football world. The president declared national mourning. Chapecoense held mass funerals in the stadium. Atlético Nacional, the Colombian club that should have faced Chapecoense in the final, asked that the title be awarded to the Brazilian team. Across South America, the story became a symbol of how a dream season, built slowly over years, could be undone in a single night by a chain of reckless decisions about fuel, time, and money. On the afternoon of September 7, 2011, the players and coaches of Lokomotiv Yaroslavl walked across the ramp at Tunoshna Airport, outside the city of Yaroslavl in central Russia. The plane waiting for them was a 3-engine Yak-42 jet, a familiar sight in the region. This was supposed to be a short charter to Minsk, Belarus, where they would open the new Continental Hockey League season against Dynamo Minsk. Almost the entire main roster was on board. Russian stars, veterans from the Czech, Slovak, Swedish, German, Latvian, and Ukrainian players, plus Canadian head coach Brad McCrimmon and his staff. Only one player from the main squad stayed behind in Yaroslavl. For everyone else, this flight was the start of a new year, a new shot at trophies. The weather that day was calm. Visibility was good, The clouds were high, and there was no storm waiting down the runway. From a passenger's point of view, there was nothing dramatic about the departure. People found their seats. Equipment bags went into the hold. Outside, the Yak-42 taxied to the end of the 3,000-meter runway and lined up for takeoff. On the flight deck were a captain, a co-pilot, and a flight engineer. The official investigation would later paint a troubling picture of their preparation. Gaps in training, weak oversight by the airline, and a co-pilot who should not have been flying this type of jet at all. But none of that was visible from the cabin. The players could hear the engines winding up, feel the vibration in the floor, and then the push of acceleration as the takeoff roll began. To the people inside, it probably felt like any other departure at first. The runway lights streamed past. The city fell away behind them. But on the instruments, something was wrong. The jet was not picking up speed the way it should. Investigators later found that one of the pilots had his feet in the wrong place on the pedals and was unknowingly pressing the brakes during the takeoff run. Instead of rolling freely, the airplane was fighting against its own wheels. The crew advanced the power, trying to make the aircraft go faster. The Yak-42 thundered down almost the entire length of the runway without lifting off. It crossed past the end, still on the ground, and only managed to stagger into the air a few hundred meters beyond the pavement, just a few meters above the grass. A security camera later showed the jet skimming low, nose up, clearly not climbing the way it should. For a moment it seemed as if it might still make it. Then the left wing hit an antenna mast beyond the runway. The impact tore at the wing and sent the jet veering to the left. With brakes no longer holding the nose down and both pilots pulling back to try to climb, the damaged aircraft pitched up too steeply and stalled. It simply stopped flying. Seconds later, it smashed into the bank of a small river that feeds into the Volga, broke apart and burst into flames. Parts of the tail ended up in the water. The forward fuselage disintegrated on the shore. People nearby saw the fireball and rushed toward the scene. Fire crews and ambulances arrived to find wreckage scattered along the riverbank. Twisted metal, burning debris, broken seats, and personal items in the grass and shallow water. Of the 45 people on board, 44 would not survive. One player was pulled out alive but died days later in hospital. The only long-term survivor was the flight engineer, badly injured but conscious enough to later describe the terrifying, endless feeling of a takeoff that never really left the ground. For the hockey world, the immediate impact was almost impossible to process. An entire team had been erased in a single accident. 26 players, coaching staff, doctors, trainers, club officials, and the flight crew. The KHL suspended its games. Memorials appeared at arenas across Russia, Europe, and North America. In Yaroslavl, thousands of fans filled the team's home rink and the main square, standing in silence around coffins draped in club colors. The technical investigation, led by the Interstate Aviation Committee, went deep into the airline's operations. They found that the crew had not properly calculated takeoff speeds, and that the co-pilot, who was at the controls, was not fully qualified on the Yak-42 and had medical issues that should have kept him from flying. Training records were weak. Instructors had signed off on skills that were not truly mastered. The airline's internal oversight was described as inadequate. Flight data showed that, throughout the takeoff roll, a braking force was acting on the aircraft. Tests and simulations pointed to the co-pilot's feet resting too high on the pedals, applying the toe brakes when he thought he was only steering. With the brakes partly on, the jet struggled to reach rotation speed, and when it finally lifted off, the sudden loss of that nose-down force, combined with strong nose-up inputs and a takeoff trim setting, produced a steep climb and an immediate stall at very low height. There was no time or altitude to recover. The final report blamed the crash on pilot error, rooted in poor training and a broken safety culture at Yak service, supported by regulators who had not enforced their own standards. One executive at the airline was later convicted in Russia for violating air safety rules. The KHL changed its travel policies, and Russian authorities temporarily grounded certain older types until operators could prove their crews were properly trained. On the night of February 2, 1959, the Winter Dance Party Tour rolled into Clear Lake, Iowa. Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, J.P. Richardson, known as the Big Bopper, and other acts had been crossing the Midwest in old buses with bad heating. Musicians were getting sick. One drummer was already in the hospital with frostbite. After the show at the Surf Ballroom, Buddy Holly decided he'd had enough of the bus and chartered a small airplane to get ahead to the next stop near Moorhead, Minnesota. The airplane was a Beechcraft Bonanza 35, a V-tailed single-engine aircraft operated by Dwyer Flying Service out of Mason City. It had 3 passenger seats plus the pilot. The charter was booked to fly from Mason City Municipal Airport to Fargo's Hector Airport, the closest field to Moorhead. Seat assignments on that airplane became part of music history. Richardson, running a fever and tired of the cold bus, took a seat that had been meant for Waylon Jennings. Valens and guitarist Tommy Alsop flipped a coin for the last spot. Valens won and went to the airport, while Alsop stayed with the bus. Everyone expected to meet again in Minnesota the next day. The pilot was 21-year-old Roger Peterson. He had about 711 hours of total flight time, including roughly 128 hours on Bonanzas and around 52 hours of instrument training. But there was a key limitation. He had failed an instrument rating check 9 months earlier and was not licensed to fly passengers in conditions that required flying only by instruments. Dwyer Flying Service was certified to conduct charter flights only under visual flight rules. Both pilot and company were limited to flights where the pilot could see the ground and the horizon. Before departure, Peterson received a weather briefing. Reports at Mason City showed light snow, a cloud base around 3,000 feet, visibility about 6 miles, and moderate winds. Those numbers didn't sound extreme, but the bigger picture included deteriorating conditions, low clouds, and areas of freezing drizzle and icing. Flash advisories about these conditions had not been clearly passed on to Peterson. Just before 1 a.m. on February 3rd, the 4 men boarded the Bonanza at Mason City. It was fully dark. The surrounding area was sparsely populated farmland with very few ground lights. There was light snow in the air and overcast cloud above. After takeoff, there would be almost no visible horizon. At about 12:55 in the morning, the Bonanza took off. Hubert Dwyer, the owner of the flying service, watched from near the control tower. He saw the tail light as the aircraft climbed out and began a left turn to the east, then another left turn to head northwest. The airplane reached only about 800 feet above the ground. Then, still in a turn, the tail light began to descend until it disappeared. There was no radio call from the pilot. A short time later, searchers found the wreckage in a frozen cornfield about 5 miles northwest of the airport. The Bonanza had impacted nose down at high speed. The engine was driven back into the cabin. All 4 occupants had been thrown clear and were found near the main wreckage. There were no survivors. The Civil Aeronautics Board investigated the accident. They examined the airframe and engine and found no evidence of mechanical failure. Fuel was on board. Control systems showed no signs of a jam or break. There was no sign of an in-flight breakup or fire. Attention turned to weather, pilot qualifications, and cockpit layout. On that dark route, under a low overcast with light snow, visual references would have disappeared almost as soon as the airplane left the ground. The board noted that visual flight was virtually impossible under those conditions, yet Peterson and Dwyer Flying Service were authorized only for visual operations. The pilot had launched into a situation that demanded instrument skills he wasn't licensed to use. There was another detail. Peterson had trained on airplanes with a modern artificial horizon, but the accident airplane had an older type of attitude indicator with a different display. This mismatch may have increased the risk of confusion for a pilot with limited instrument experience. The final report concluded that the probable cause was the pilot's loss of control during a night climb in poor weather, resulting from spatial disorientation. Contributing factors were the pilot's lack of instrument experience, the failure of the weather briefing to emphasize the severity of conditions, and the operator's use of visual rules for a flight that quickly entered instrument weather. For the music world, this became "The Day the Music Died," a line from Don McLean's song American Pie that fixed February 3, 1959, in popular memory. For aviation, the lesson was quieter but enduring. A small airplane at night, in winter weather, with a pilot not fully qualified for instruments, left almost no margin for error once the runway lights fell behind and the horizon disappeared.